It is now my privilege to introduce to you our keynote speaker for the evening. Congressman Geoff Davis represents Kentucky's 4th District. He serves on the House Ways and Means Committee, where he serves as chairman of the Subcommittee on Human Resources and as a member of the Trade Subcommittee. He is also co-chairman of the National Security Interagency Reform Working Group and holds a leadership role within the Republican Conference as a deputy whip. Congressman Davis attended the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York. Upon graduation, he served as an assault helicopter flight commander in the 82nd Airborne Division and later ran U.S. Army aviation operations for peace enforcement between Israel and Egypt. Congressman Davis is a former Army Ranger and senior parachutist. At the 208th Army Aviation Association of America Convention, Congressman Davis was inducted into the Honorable Order of St. Michael, Silver Award for Lifetime Achievement, and conspicuous contribution in support of the aviation branch. The award was presently presented by Lieutenant General James D. Thurman, the U.S. Army Chief of Operations. In 1992, Congressman Davis started his own consulting firm specializing in lean manufacturing. His role as a small businessman has assisted him in Congress as he works to support policies that will promote economic growth and keep America business competitive. In October 2009, Congressman Davis was honored as an outstanding advocate by the Women's Crisis Center of Northern Kentucky for his work to fight domestic violence in Kentucky. He and his wife, Pat, live in Hebron, Kentucky. They are proud parents of 6 children and recently welcomed their first grandchild. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Congressman Geoff Davis.
Thank you very much. My wife, Pat, and I are proud to tell you that 3 of those 6 are taxpayers now. So, which for those of you with grown children, that's a special moment. Where to begin? I really want to share some remarks from the heart. It's really an honor to be with you tonight, and I mean it in so many ways. We, I guess, technically are in our 4th decade of service to the country in one form or another, either active, reserve, civilian with the military, certainly the work in the House of Representatives. It's just like dealing with the clan leaders and warlords that you dealt with in Afghanistan and Iraq, except they just don't carry weapons, that's all. But the one thing that often happens, and I've seen so many things happen over my lifetime, the first thing that I want to comment on is the professionalism of the Guard. I have seen on the ground, I go back to when I enlisted. I was an E4 when I got picked up to go to the military academy. And it was in a time, for those of you that have gray hair like Ben over here in the 1970s, we have a lot of friends in common from task force and some other places there. But the one thing that I would say is we came into the Army institutionally at the end of the Vietnam War, when it was going through not simply a reset with equipment and tools, but rethinking what the institution of the Army was. And the reserves and the National Guard in particular at that time were not the best prepared fighting units. Not that the regular Army was in the best shape either, but many of you gray-haired or less-haired people who are here remember what those days were like. And in fact, I can tell you that the change is so remarkable, being on the ground in Iraq, in Afghanistan, with units from the Reserve and Guard, particularly just very memorable visit with the 149th, the Mountain Warriors in Iraq, and seeing not only their professionalism on the ground doing what they were doing, the combat engineers, the MPs. I could start naming units that I've had interaction with or families that we've held. The one thing I can tell you from the regular Army side, friends of mine, lifelong friends like Bernie Champeau, who commands the 25th Infantry Division now, friends like Jimmy McConville, who commands the 101st Airborne Division now, others who came before me in every major tactical formation. The reputation of our Guard and Reserves, and especially the feedback that I get as a Kentuckian on the Kentucky Guard, is one force and one fight. And the standards that you have upheld because of the dedication and training of the officers, warrant officers, and non-commissioned officers, and the motivation and the warrior ethos that all of you men and women in uniform have put in, bear great honor on the highest traditions of the United States. And I really want you to know that. And I'll say one thing, too, for the spouses who are here. I think that, you know, people look at the military deploying and it's hard. But I think it's a lot harder to be running the family resource group, to be the wife or the husband behind with the kids and maintaining the family and dealing with the to and fro, and every time the phone rings. And I think in some ways the joys of having instant communication, Pat and I can remember when we yelled at each other on satellite phones just to be heard. You know, back when we thought that was pretty cool technology versus mailing a letter, which might have taken, you know, 2 weeks or more to get to where we were. Things are instantaneous now, but at the same time, I believe that that has ratcheted up the stress levels in many ways because of the uncertainty. And the other thing that I think creates this level of uncertainty is the fact that unlike the neighborhood that I grew up in, had veterans from World War I, veterans from World War II, veterans from the Korean War, a few young guys. Somebody who inspired me back in 1964 was a young Special Forces E5 who was just back from his first tour in Vietnam and getting ready to go back again, and sent me a little miniature set of jungle fatigues that were made up for a 6-year-old, which made me very cool because I was never cool, and at least my clothes were at that time. But this inspired me, the character of all of these men that I knew, and it was, these weren't, I didn't know what the service academies were. I didn't even know what officers were. These were citizen soldiers, and told their stories, not in any kind of a graphic way, but the idea to be part of something bigger than yourself. You know, and for me, that went an extra mile because it became a goal. The Army, in a way, was the gateway. It was my first family. When I grew up, I met my dad when I was 24. I'd been in the service for 7 years. I grew up in a home like some of you may have here that had the service as the breakout. Certainly some of your troops, the first fight that I got into, I was 6. And it wasn't on the schoolyard. It was stepping between my mother cowering before a drunken, angry, very violent stepfather who was beating her up. And that was the first time I ever got punched in my life. Certainly those kinds of experiences shape you. And I wish you were alive to see me chair the subcommittee that oversees $230 billion worth of programs and all of this that addresses the full spectrum of our safety net, as well as being very involved, you know, in the defense side. And I'm not sharing that with you to talk about ego and say, hey, isn't this guy cool? Because I know too many politicians that just believe their press releases. And the deeper reality, I think, speaks to the greatness of this country. I was asked when we received that award on dealing with advocacy over battered women and working with organizations like CASA and other organizations like that. Before we get to the military start, I would tell this. I was asked at this conference, the reporter stood up and said, well, we heard you got to West Point. That's so unusual. Because I'm usually the guy in the room that says, oh, I didn't go to college, I went to West Point. And if there's a Naval Academy person running around out here, yes, the two things that Naval Academy and West Point graduates all have in common is they were offered appointments to West Point. But not real high on the humor at the moment. But I was asked this question, what did you get out of West Point? And I just blurted this out. And I said, the two things that I got out of the military academy was first I met Jesus Christ, and the second thing I met my wife, Pat, who's managed to stay with me for 31 years. And what I will tell you is, at the root of it, and what really began the change for me was it was the first time being in the Army that I was around, we didn't see a lot of women in those days, men of character who represented a warrior ethos, that represented honor, that were absolutely uncompromising in their standards. And sometimes they made me really mad at them because you had to do this stuff. And over time, those values began to go from the outside to the inside. And as I got older, I think I'd be a good company commander today. I wasn't a bad one back in the old days. But I began to understand even more the investment in leadership that we make with those that we lead. And the life-changing experiences that aren't simply a matter of what comes out of combat, but what comes out of that investment in that scared, skinny kid who wants to be part of something, and that character gets passed to the next generation. Probably where I saw this in the greatest way of all was when I was asked in God's providence to go back to Fort Benning in 2007 as the surge had already started to turn. For those of you who were over there at that time with the 149th, I know it was hard. I wish I could have said to the group I met with in one of the mess halls at Camp Liberty what I was shared in a skiff from one of my classmates. that the numbers had turned so completely. And my first reaction when I was over there was I grabbed my buddy of nearly 30 years and I said, "You've done it. You've done it," because he wrote he was the staff director for most of the planning, and he pushes me away from him like only a close friend can do. And he said, "No, I didn't do anything." And he had tears in his eyes, and he said, "They did it." He said it was those privates and specialists and sergeants and lieutenants and captains that won this thing and made up for all of the mistakes that had been made politically and strategically going in on the front end. And But what it speaks to, again, is these are investments that go across our nation in many ways. But here's the difference between that neighborhood that I grew up in the early 1960s. You know, in World War II, we had 12, almost 13 million people under arms in uniform. That was 10% of the population. There was no family that was not affected by that. Now, I'm going to tell you one thing, and I may make some of the old folks here unhappy. You know, we have all of this talk of the greatest generation, and I revere my elders who came before me. And I will preface what I'm going to say with that. I revere them for answering that call in that dire and dark time. But I will tell you this, as a student of history for many, many decades now, I will tell you this, that yes, that was termed the greatest generation of responding to that call and going through a time of great change. But for the military now, I have developed a different view. I hear all this garbage about the 99% versus the 1%. I want to tell you something, folks. The people on both sides of the punditry on all the cable news channels who want to opine about what that is have all got it wrong, because you're the 1%. The 1% that defends this country, the 1% that responds, the 1% that understands what it means when that phone rings, the 1% that understands that though you may be angered to a point of nodding of your stomach when you hear of Westboro Baptist Church and other folks like that, you understand as the 1% that answering that call is what defends their right to the freedom of speech, and any citizen can say what they want in this nation and go to sleep and not be in fear like the places that you serve. And you have given that to us. I think the one thing that I want to share with you that we're facing as a nation right now, we've all heard about the drawdowns, we've heard about the budgetary challenges. I've been the first to say that is wrong. I believe that reducing the size of the force is a huge mistake right now. The force has to change how it functions. But the one challenge, and this is where we're going to get into a little bit of the politics for a moment, to paint the strategic picture of what I believe is ahead in the out years. And though, for the sake of my youngest children, Pat and I have chosen to step down for a season. We're not going to go too far away from being able to torment you all and have a very big interest in what happens with the military in this country longer term. We have too much of our... The right way to do it, and we got this right a couple of times in the history of this nation, is you invest in people, not in equipment. The first thing you do is invest in people. After you invest in people, not unlike what you do in business, you look at your market space. What's the environment going to be? What are the inevitabilities that will drive strategy? Because all good strategy needs to be driven by inevitabilities. The next thing that you do is you develop the doctrine by which you are going to respond to that situation, the capabilities, not just the intent, but the capabilities of your potential opponents. And then finally, you're going to develop the systems and the tools to execute that doctrine. See, right now, we do it wrong in Washington, D.C., and we've allowed ourselves to fall into a place where we've got systems and disconnected bureaucracies that don't necessarily communicate with one another, and guess what's happening? Just Infantry Branch sent out a letter right before Christmas to lieutenants in the Year Group 2005, letting them know that how many of them don't need to be coming back. And it's a response symptomatically to not wanting to deal with cost based on annuities for personnel and benefits versus looking at the deeper issues of the insurance policy and the longer-term impact, a positive side that it has for this country. The things that we face right now are very, very serious. There's actually open discussions where we're going to find the old Air Force and Navy versus Army and Marine Corps divide on roles of primacy strategically. And this is not getting into the jokes that Ed and I might have. I'm sorry, General Tonini. I'm an aviator after all. I go on first name basis. And And you can too, just for tonight if you want to. So, although I'm not responsible for your field grade Article 15 afterwards, but you can appeal to my office, and we'll tell you we can't help you because of the way the ethics rules work. But more importantly, what's driving a lot of this is the need, and if you look at the trade press, the Air Force is talking about increasing this strategic capability and the need for the more F-35s, and the Navy wants more big ships and more submarines, and we're talking about all of these other issues. And who's taking short shrift of this is the ground forces. And there's this kind of miracle, like the problem-solving bubble that says, and now a miracle happens and the answer appears. We're going to unlearn potentially 10 years of very hard-fought lessons in counterinsurgency and what it means in dealing with low-intensity conflict. Now, for those of you, as a friend of mine likes to say, low-intensity conflict ain't low when the bullet is going by your ass. But the one thing that I will say in the midst of this, though, is that these are the kinds of wars that traditionally we have been involved in, one way or the other. The Marine Corps, up until World War II, had a small wars doctrine. We resurrected so much of that with our joint services and with our civilian partners to do incredibly great things that hadn't been seen since the early days of the Vietnam War. What was done with provincial reconstruction teams, what was done by many of you sitting in this room working as advisors to other units. And this isn't getting into the politics of war. That's constitutionally sits in a different place. But what it does show is the adaptability of relearning these old lessons and applying these principles to move forward. And it is imperative for the Guard, especially, that is the closest of the uniformed services to the people in the place that I go to work every week, to let them know that this is a huge mistake to fall back on some kind of Cold War mentality. The Chinese are not going to make war against us. Because if Walmart were a country, they'd be their 8th largest trading partner. I mean, some of this is common sense when we think about it. Does that mean that there's absolutely no threat and we shouldn't be strong? No, I don't say that. But we can work that, for example, through trade, through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, doing things that interlock people together. And I don't personally believe that we're being helpful to ourselves, with saber rattling in other parts of the world. Because it's the soldiers, my friend Barry McCaffrey say, the old general is always slow to fight. Because many of you in this room know what the actual impact of policy is. And it's one of the reasons that I got into the interagency work to try to change the way information is communicated and building a coalition. And guess what we're fighting? We're fighting entrenched forces on Capitol Hill. And it's not like there's some kind of evil plot or conspiracy. They're just living in another era. And I'm going to tell you, in my job, it's a great job if you're ADD. Because you're moving from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing in 15-minute increments, and a lot of my colleagues, God bless them, don't have the time or the inclination to get down to the depth in policy and understand the cause-effect relationships. And when you deal with national security, the other thing that's a problem is a lot of my colleagues in a blowback from the other side of the Vietnam War are deathly afraid to say that something is going wrong in the defense world out of fear of being called un-American. And the only people who are standing up in the Congress right now and calling for real reform of the defense processes are, guess who? It's a little merry band of us who are operational veterans, and the most vocal of them are the guys who come back, who got elected, who came back from Afghanistan and Iraq, saying we've got to do some things different. The center of gravity in this fight is in the Pentagon, and it's in the senior executive service. For those of you who deal with the personnel world, think guys like David Chu, who was the Undersecretary of Personnel, who had the temerity to look me in the eye at a committee hearing and say that the annuity was too expensive for the personnel and therefore we'd have to downsize. And this is brought you by the same civilian bureaucracy that is counting beans and not measuring the pints of blood that are spilled on the battlefield. A member of the 940th MP Company, much to my shock, told me in December 2005 when we were sitting at Walter Reed talking, I came to find out that a guardsman or a reservist of equal time and grade who's sitting next to a regular Army soldier of equal time and grade, and they both lose their left or right knee in an identical way with an IED, that the regular soldier, when he is medically retired, is actually compensated at a higher level than the guardsman or the reservist. I came out of my socks. I thought, oh, this is an easy one. We'll point that out and just say, hey, it'll get fixed. And the response from the Office of the Secretary of Defense was dismissive. It wasn't simply, we don't really think this would work. We introduced the Citizen Soldier Equality Act in honor of a sergeant from Lewis County named Carlos Farler. who was the soldier that brought this to my attention, who's had his life physically changed forever because of his experiences in Iraq. And I know there are some people in here that probably know Carlos, but I want to tell you something about, you know, watching him try to walk into a room to meet with me at another meeting back here in Kentucky was a reminder of the very serious responsibility that elected officials have that most of them are clueless about. It's easy to have the soundbite. It's easy to go and say thank you for your service. It's hard to get into a fight with an entrenched regulatory bureaucracy that wants to do its own thing, that it traditionally has learned that they can wait out the uniformed military and wait out the elected officials, and they will win the fight. We have passed that to equalize the disability 3 different times out of the House of Representatives in my time there. 3 times. The total cost to equalize that, as you know what it is? It's about $1.5 million a year. Think about that. $1.5 million a year. We could equalize that for life for these catastrophically wounded veterans who are medically retired. Now, here's what happened. It died in the Senate every time, every time, every time. I talked to Senator John Warner, and he was a former Secretary of the Navy, and he was a veteran himself, and I'm thinking, here's a guy that maybe should get it. And he said so-and-so in the senior executive service in DOD didn't want this done. And there's a point to the story that I'm sharing with you here. And I said, I don't understand, sir. I just don't understand. You can't tell you know, and they said, well, they have insurance. They can go back to their civilian jobs. And I looked at this guy and I said, I beg to differ with you, Senator. A guy who was a truck driver in the National Guard who doesn't have his hands anymore is not going to be able to go and drive that truck. Why are we doing this? He said, well, to tell you the truth, I was told by Deputy Assistant Secretary so-and-so in the senior executive service that they can't let the camel's nose get underneath the tent with the Guard and the reserves. Now, how does that make you feel? I'm going to say, and I'm going to speak biblically in this, if this doesn't piss you off, I don't know what will. And it is a very, very important symptom of the wider problem. And I'm not saying this to make you mad, because I'm coming here with a solution to the problem. Here's the bigger question. How are you going to deal with your legislators? How are we going to deal with Congress? And ultimately, as a Guard and Reserve force and a wider military force, how are we going to deal with that entrenched bureaucracy that wants to go along and get along and do its thing, and the people who are the flexion, if you will, the steam valve for barriers and difficulties are, in fact, the uniformed services, specifically the ground forces. I've flown on your aircraft overseas. I have, for the Air Guard people who are here, I have walked with many of your units. I can tell you what, those folks don't have any idea of the world that you live in when you're out there in the box, because they're looking at it from a different perspective. And that brings us to this: how do I deal with congressmen? And how do I deal with senators? And I'll put it the way when I spoke the General Officer Orientation course a few years ago. It's something like this. You guys and gals look so professional. You know, you're standing tall, and you look at members of Congress and you think they got long hair, they got bad haircuts, they're kind of overweight like me, they slouch, they've got their hands in their pockets. Think aviators. All right? So you should feel comfortable. And here's the thing that the members of Congress, because so few of them have any access to, have ever really been around real military people, I mean, to really get to know them. I'm not talking about coming in and out on a Codell for 3 hours, making sure that the public affairs person doesn't, you know, bust a vein and have a stroke because they're worried that you might say something about the unit that might end up with some, you know, congressional inquiry coming down. I'm talking about getting to know folks. And I'm going to tell you what I hashed with a former Ranger instructor of mine, a guy named Bernie Champeau, who some of you served with in the room here. Bernie commands the 25th Division. Bernie was one hell of a soldier in every measure of merit. If there was a Christian general in the Army today, it is him. And he is one of the hardest commanders and one of the most sensitive and caring officers I have ever met. He did my pre-ranger for us when we were at when I was in the basic course. It wasn't Fort Benning, it was down here at Fort Knox. I'm going through a scout program, but he was doing the advanced course there. He did our pre-ranger. I swear I did so well in the course largely because of his discipleship, if you will, and learning a whole lot of field craft I didn't know I needed to do. Well, here was the other side of it. Then I get to Fort Benning, and I'm sitting next to my Ranger buddy, who's now on the two-star promotable list, a guy named Joey DeSalvo. And Joey and I are sitting there in one of those 5-minute breaks that you get for you Ranger qualified folks out there, and he said, "Hey, look, it's Captain Champeau." And me, you know, who could never get elected to student council, I'm like, "Oh, that's great, let's go say hi to him." And he goes, "Yeah, sure, let's do that." And I got up and I walked over and I said, "Hey, Captain Champeau," and I turned around and I'm all alone in front of all these Ranger students with a brand new Ranger instructor captain who had me, you know, my feet up on a tree for about a half an hour yelling at me, and I got to do push-ups with my face in the mud and all those good character building things that have helped me to adapt well to the world of Washington, D.C. But Bernie and I reconnected many years later when he was a brigadier general, and it was actually at a hearing in the Armed Services Committee, and I saw him, and my first image when I saw the face, I'm like, I know this guy, and then I had this vision of torment return to me. And I kept looking at him, and he was getting uncomfortable and thought something was wrong with his uniform, and I kept looking at him trying to get his attention, and then I went over and sat down next to him to give him a note, and he thought, because of some of the proclivities that were going on in the Congress at the time, that I was asking him out on a date, which made him move over a whole seat over when we sat down. Well, we got all of that worked out okay, and as we rekindled our friendship, we hatched a plan, particularly when he came back from his senior role in Afghanistan, now to run congressional liaison, because it was Houston, we have a problem time for the Army, because there was this great gulf fixed on what was happening. You know, and during the surge, for those of you that got to go over there, I had 3 of my classmates came and said, "We want you to deliver something to President Bush because we don't think he's getting the story about what's actually going on the ground." And I took a little PowerPoint presentation that some of you may have seen that was written by a young Marine major named Travis Patriquin, who had just been killed in Anbar Province. It was a little stick figure thing called How to Win in Anbar Province. And for somebody who's studied the Middle East for, you know, quite a while like me, this was the best explanation of working inside of Arabic and Islamic culture and dealing with the counterinsurgency that could be explained to a 3rd grader. It was wonderful. And so it's perfectly good for senior executives in the federal government and also for members of the Senate and the House. It got into a very tense time. And I went into this, I was sitting in the cabinet room and with a group of members of Congress in both parties, and we were there for this listening session about the surge. And the president was opining based on what he had been told. Listen to this, what he had been told. I believe that Barack Obama or George Bush or Bill Clinton, forgetting all the politics, when it comes to the issues of national security, they are trying to make the best decisions for the United States of America and for this country. And don't you let any idiot on Fox News or MSNBC tell you otherwise. They're trying to make decisions based on very complex factors that so many of us in here have experienced. They're getting advisors. They are surrounded in a world of noise. And we knew something wasn't getting through. And President Bush was looking across the table, and I knew this was a critical time. And you knew from the people that we have had to bury that this was a critical time to get things righted. And President Bush said, "Well, this is what the Army's telling me." And I got spanked a lot as a kid. And I said, "Mr. President," because who I cared about, my loyalty was to the guys I served with. And they asked me to do this thing, and I was going to do it for them. And I figured getting thrown out of the White House is a small price to pay for this. And I handed that PowerPoint presentation to President Bush, and Karl Rove was not happy with me. But that's okay, because I'm never happy with him, so we're fine with this. And but here was the next thing that happened. And the president was talking, and he said, "I'm going to tell you, this is what the Army's telling me." And I just said, "With all due respect, Mr. President, that's not what the Army thinks." And it got dead quiet in that cabinet room. And I almost wondered if I should have worn the pens when I went to this meeting. But, you know, but I had, well, I'd been to too many funerals at that point, frankly. And I just said, "Mr. President, I want you to go down as the most successful president in history. I want to win this thing as much as anybody. But I'm going to tell you something. My friends who command brigades, and my friends who command battalions, and my friends who are on senior staffs, and the young enlisted guys that I know, and people at all ranks across this, that I know, especially across the Army, have a very different opinion than what you just shared." And I said, "I know groups of battalion commanders who can't get their point across into this room when you all are formulating this policy." And I said that document, and I shared some other things in that meeting, were what was actually this viewpoint. And I walked out of there, and particularly with what went on as the surge ramped up and the meeting in Baghdad later with my friend that I alluded to earlier, all of these things, I've wondered, how are we going to deal with this? And that's when Bernie walked into my life again. right after, actually a month after this meeting. And we sat down and we started a program that was very evangelistic in the nature, and that was to bring the good news about the United States Army, regular, reserve, and National Guard, into the halls of Congress. The Air Force does a great job, frankly, a much better job than what the Army did. But the Guard in particular, I think, needs to take this message to the next level. We developed a program that was called Adopt a Congressman. And the point was, and this is very scary stuff. Now, you all in the Guard know most of us anyway, and those of you who know me, you can just call me. Probably a third of you in this room have my cell phone number anyway, and some of you have used it before to call, whether it's from family resource groups or otherwise, and I welcome those. But most of my colleagues don't know how to talk with you, because you know what happens when a congressman says they want to talk to somebody about a defense issue? It'll go through 4, 5, 6, 7. I know one briefing, I had a friend come over. He had to get 9 sign-offs on a PowerPoint briefing that I promptly threw in the trash. We closed the door, I kicked his aide out, and then we talked for an hour and a half. Because we need information. And the way for what is about to happen to the military, which is the $64 question, not only are we talking about a reset, but for those of you who are old enough to remember it, I would go back to the 1970s. The institutional military right now is taking a beating at the expense of the civilian bureaucracy, and a lack of understanding on the part of the American people that would never, never have been tolerated in that era when you had the World War I, World War II, and Korea veterans, because there were so many elected officials who had served themselves and led on the front line. People remember names like Strom Thurmond. He was a company commander in the 101st Airborne Division, along with another guy from Florida named Claude Pepper, who was known more for AARP advocacy and things like. George McGovern, the liberal, was a B-17 pilot in World War II. I mean, it was on both sides of the aisle. They understood implicitly these issues. The Congress is not that way in the House and Senate today on these issues. And the way that you're going to be able to help guys like me in the future to undo what potentially could happen to our military is going to be building these relationships. The relationships are number one. I could speak out of turn. I know this is not a problem with your adjutant general. It is a problem with other adjutant generals. But to encourage as well with your junior officers to get to know members of this delegation, to get to know members of the staff at a personal level, especially your young up-and-coming officers. You all in the room who are a little long in the tooth about getting ready to go the way of the world, to build that relationship. We got the chairman of the Appropriations Committee in this state. We have a subcommittee chairman on Ways and Means, a subcommittee chairman on Energy and Commerce. You have another member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And, John Yarmouth here in Louisville is a pretty engaged guy. But overall, our delegation is very strong. And those relationships, especially, you might say, well, that's not the Armed Services Committee. Exactly. Think counterinsurgency. You've got to go the whole of government, because 90% of the legislation in the Congress goes through 3 committees: Ways and Means, Energy and Commerce, and Appropriations. Now, that may not be what a military crowd wants to hear, but I'm telling you, that's why I sit on the Ways and Means Committee, because on the Ways and Means Committee, I can help the Army a whole lot more than I could when I was on the Armed Services Committee. And I do. And what I want you all to do is find ways to build those relationships and tell your brothers and sisters in the other states to do the same thing, to build the relationships, to reach out, so that when the young major who's sitting in the room here, man, I never thought I'd call Major young, that young major that's sitting in the room here is a lieutenant colonel or a colonel, they can pick up that subcommittee chair's phone and say, hey, can I come and talk to you? That you've got that relationship. That is how we got most of the major reforms that have ever happened for any good in this military in my lifetime has been because of those kind of relationships. And there is risk associated with them. If you do that, we can make a huge difference, because that change is coming. I want to leave you, as we address this, though, with one final thought. And a couple of you have heard me share this before. And I don't want this to be the typical shameless politician speech. Thank you for your service. We appreciate all you've done. I mean, I think you know from my heart and from Pat's heart that we do care very much about what you've done. Because you know that lonely time. You know what it's like to be wandering through Kroger's if you're a wife or spouse here, and with the weight of the world on your shoulders, wondering what is happening with your husband on the other side of the world. You know what it's like when there are things not going right with the kids and you feel helpless as a parent and you're on the other side of the world and you can't do anything about it because there's missions to run. But we can overcome this together. But I want to leave you with one thought in these challenges. And as I believe that there is a great opportunity to do some great things in restructuring the force, but also to make sure that it stays strong and vibrant and doesn't get caught up in the political calculus of a presidential election year and what's going to come in the subsequent 2 Congresses when all of this stuff is going to get teed up. Build the relationships, you can change the policy, but keep this last story in mind. At that same time when I mentioned the surge, and I was a very unhappy camper and was ready to just throw the towel in and say, the heck with this, I'll go back to a real job in the private sector and do what I can do from there. We got a phone call. My roommate in West Point was a guy named Mark Ritter. He was the chief of staff of the 101st Airborne Division at that time. And we had the unfortunate duty of reconnecting because of casualties from my area. But it was kind of known that if you had an issue, you could call my office down at Fort Campbell, because we take calls, frankly, from service member families from all over the state. And we don't care. We don't ask you what zip code you're in when you call. It's part of the family. And it was 2 sergeants from the 101st Airborne Division that wanted to come, and they were told they could come and see Geoff. And so we said, we cleared the schedule. They didn't know what it's like to try to schedule a meeting to come in and have a visit. And here was what happened from that point on. They were 2 combat engineers. They'd been catastrophically wounded on their 2nd tour, trying to disarm a very large improvised explosive device inside a Buffalo. The vehicle was destroyed. There were fatal casualties in this, and their lives were changed forever. And they came hobbling into my office. It was the first time a couple of my young staff members had ever seen what a wounded soldier looked like, who had really been badly wounded. And they came into my office and sat down with me and my military assistant at the time, a retired 26-year Special Forces officer named Dan Adelstein, who some of you know in the room here. And it was an incredible conversation. It was sobering. There were times that it was encouraging. And the one thing that old and young soldiers can do is laugh, because you can laugh at the silly stuff. Because, you know, it's like it says in Proverbs, even in laughter the heart may ache, but you find those things that you can laugh at. And then, as often happens in the meetings in my office, the vote buzzer went off, because vote schedules aren't calibrated with the usual business of the House and meeting and hearing schedules, and I had to run and vote. And I said to them just before going out the door, I said, I'd like to take you across the street to the Capitol to come and see the People's House, kind of get a sense of what this is all about. And they said they really wanted to do that. And so Dan offered, Colonel Adelstein offered to drive them over, because it's a pretty good haul from my office, and they said, no, we're walking. And that was the closest some of my colleagues have ever been to what a real soldier smells like. Walking over there, hobbling over. He got him up into the gallery. I came up into the gallery to visit with them after I was done with my part of the voting, and pointed out some of the figures that they'd recognize from the news. They got to see the kind of high school cafeteria swirl of people down there where this business is actually getting done. And I told them, I said, I want to let you guys know, because of you doing what you did, this is allowed to work. Now hear that. This is allowed to work. And then at the end, just as kind of a throwaway, I said, hey, I'd like to take you to one other place. It's a really cool view of the Capitol, from the Capitol, to the place called the Speaker's Balcony. And so we walked out through Statuary Hall, which had been a House chamber from 1814 to 1857. The House chamber they were in had been in continuous operation since 1857. We walked through the rotunda, which, for those of you, remember this as not a place where presidents lie in state, but a hospital where Union soldiers bled and died on that floor in the rotunda, because it was the largest room in the District of Columbia at the time during the Civil War. We walked from there back down the hallway behind Senator McConnell's office, and then out onto the Speaker's balcony. I pointed out the icons of the nation. They could see the flags from the World War II memorial in the distance, Civil War memorials up close. They could look down Pennsylvania Avenue and see where the 101st Airborne Division, their own unit, their own heritage and traditions, had marched during or after the Second World War, and again after Desert Storm, the last time that the nation publicly thanked in a ceremony its service members for answering the call of the Commander-in-Chief. And then it was time to go, and I thought, we're done now, and I was walking back in. In the last administration, the Vice President's office was right by that doorway. And as we walked back into the door of the rotunda, the stand of the 5 colors of the services were up against the wall next to that door. And everything changed. For this old soldier and those 2 young soldiers, we could not speak. There were no words to say. Because as we looked at the Army flag on top of all of those streamers, in God's providence or serendipity, I don't know what, but on top of the Army flag, the streamer that was there was Lexington and Concord in 1775, the first time that Americans took up arms in the defense of liberty. We were so moved and overcome emotionally, and as we walked out through this small hallway into the entrance to the rotunda, and we looked up at I was going to try to point out the painting on the ceiling, and as this young sergeant named Kevin Jason looked up at the painting of our heritage and our icons on the roof, on the ceiling of the rotunda, he stammered out these words with tears streaming down his face, and seconds later both of us were joining him, and he said these words, "Now I know what I've been fighting to defend, this idea, this idea." And my friends, whether you were manning your post at home, whether you were manning your post overseas, you were helping those families, you were helping those troops, you were encouraging them to keep going every day, dealing with the most mundane tasks of getting radios to the 940th MP unit when they were out of touch, or somebody who could just get something from home to those guys and gals that were over there, the encouraging messages back, to all the things that you had to deal with. At the end of the day, the sum of all of those labors, the sum of what we wear on our lapels, what you carry in your hearts, more importantly, is what preserves that idea that gives us this free republic. And I thank you for what you do. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
Thank you, Congressman Davis, for your very, very insightful words. On behalf of the men and women of the